I'm sorry I went out and grabbed some of you and said to come in. When that bell rings, come in. See, I'm old, I can do that, Laura. Welcome to Live Oak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. I'm Gloria Liggett, and I'm the worship associate this morning. In this liberal religious community, we welcome all. Our generations join together to nurture spiritual growth and personal transformation.
Our call to worship this morning was written by David White. It's entitled, "The Opening of Eyes." That day I saw beneath dark clouds the passing light over the water, and I heard the voice of the world speak out. I knew then, as I had before, life is no passing memory of what has been, nor the remaining pages in a great book waiting to be read. It is the opening of eyes long closed. It is a vision of far-off things seen for the silence they hold. It is the heart, after years of secret conversing, speaking out loud in the clear air. It is Moses in the desert, fallen to his knees before a lit bush. It is a man throwing away his shoes as if to enter heaven and finding himself astonished, opened at last, fallen in love with solid ground. Last Sunday, when Reverend Tamara spoke, she had you participate in an activity where you shared a little bit about where you come from. So this morning it seemed appropriate for me to share a little bit more about where I come from. I am from my grandmother, who grew up on a dry farm in South Dakota during the Dust Bowl. When she was 7 years old, her father left the farm and the family. I can only imagine how much grit my great-grandmother must have had in order to feed 7 children on her own. I am also from my grandfather, who grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. He moved around a lot because that's what you did when you couldn't make up the back rent. My grandparents met during the Second World War in San Francisco, and they quickly married before my grandfather was sent overseas. My mother was born while he was away. These 2 grandparents, these 2 strands of my story, tell you a little bit about me. They tell you some of the likely values that shaped my childhood, values like perseverance and hard work. These strands also tell you which generation I belong to and likely my citizenship status. That information is referred to as my social location. My social location is that point where all the features embodied in a person overlap. It places us, it places me in a particular relationship to other people, to the dominant culture of the United States, and to the rest of the world. It determines the kinds of power and privilege that I have access to and can exercise, as well as the situations in which I may have less power or privilege. And this relational matrix of power and privilege is what I wish to bring your attention to within my story this morning. I'm going to share some more pieces of my story, and in doing so, I hope to invite you to see how these things interlock with one another. But first, I want to invoke that metaphor that Maya Angelou gives us in her beautiful poem about the caged bird, and extend it a little bit more. Because the gilded cage that she refers to is a great metaphor for understanding where we are in relationship to one another. This gilded bird cage has all the features of a standard cage. There's a top and a bottom, there are bars and doors, and inside there are rungs. And these features are made up of the sum total of all the histories of all the people and all the cultures from around the world, from the beginning of time until now. And upon the rungs inside there perch beautiful birds. The top of the cage is more desirable for all the obvious reasons. It is more spacious, the food is better, and the views are like Santa Barbara. As one moves down the cage, though, the conditions worsen and the crowding gets worse. At the bottom of the cage, there's just not enough. And the birds here are subject to the obvious problems of being low in the cage. The birds at the top like it up there. And they work very hard to make sure that they and their children can enjoy the benefits of being at the top. The birds at the top have been there so long that they've largely forgotten about the down low birds. Not completely, of course. They sometimes will fly down and bring gifts and encouragement, but they always return to their own rungs in the cage. The top birds have been in this cage for so long that they have forgotten that there are bars at all. They no longer see the bars. They've learned to just accept that this is just how things are and to fear anything that might cause them to see the bars or, heavens forbid, to rattle the bars of that cage. They know they are not free, but in the absence of freedom, stability is very well accepted. Some of the birds are brave and bold enough to step off of their perches, and they're the ones that we pay attention to. But still, we are locked in this cage. Now let's return to my story and see if you can see the bars and the rungs. After the World War, that Second World War ended, my grandfather continued his service in the Air Force as a mechanic, and my grandmother worked in the civil service. They were stationed all over the country, and they ultimately settled in the Sacramento area, where they bought a house by taking advantage of the GI Bill. The GI Bill is a critical piece of my family story here. It was passed in 1944, and the GI Bill provided, among many other things, access to low-interest home mortgages for returning servicemen. This bill transformed the landscape of the United States and resulted in the largest increase in home ownership this country, and frankly the world, has ever seen. It helped elevate my grandparents from poor and struggling to stable and middle class. And thus the GI Bill altered radically the trajectory of my family. By taking advantage of the GI Bill, my grandparents gained access to the American dream. They were elevated from lower working class poor to middle class. And as a result, my mother had access to great education and was the first in her family to go to college. She and my father, also a college graduate, continued that upward trajectory, and I enjoyed an upper middle class childhood. My brother and I both have college degrees, and in just 59 days, I will have my master's degree. And I know of no other reverends on either side of my family. The GI Bill was good for my family. The GI Bill was good for a lot of families. It was especially good for white families. For the GI Bill was essentially closed to African American and other non-white families. local ordinances restricting where blacks could buy or rent, and all-white governing boards ensured that the benefits of the GI Bill were bestowed amongst almost exclusively white people. In fact, of the first 67,000 mortgages offered under the GI Bill, only 100 went to non-whites. 100 out of 67,000. It wasn't until the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968 that this dramatic transfer of land wealth began to be addressed. But it was too little too late. A whole generation of whites had already experienced a rapid acceleration of wealth accumulation and were fast passing their accumulated wealth to their children. When my grandparents died in 2004 and 2005, I received an inheritance from their estate that allowed me to purchase a condo and then later to turn that into the purchase of a home here in Santa Barbara. That inheritance also helped make it possible for me to not work after Ethan was born, and it allowed my family to have stability. I recall the bittersweet tears I cried the day that I received that inheritance. The relief at what that money would allow my family to do, and the relief and then the grief. The grief of also missing my grandparents and also missing my mother. For my mother had died many years hence, and the only reason I was receiving that inheritance was because she wasn't there to receive it herself. So it was bittersweet. So this boon in my life is complicated. An inheritance that allowed me to receive financial stability and stay home with my children is also the direct result of racist policies in this country. This shifts the understanding I have of my story. I can no longer just blindly celebrate the achievements and the hard work of my family. Of course they worked hard. Of course they worked hard. Everyone, though, works hard. Brown, black, mixed, or white. But some of us were told that the race is next week. And those that finished the race were congratulated and given the best. And I might never have questioned this narrative of my life had I not gone to seminary. When I landed at the Iliff School of Theology in the fall of 2013, I already understood that my social location as a white, educated liberal meant I enjoyed unearned privileges, and I had long railed against it. I had already been committed to social justice work for decades prior to entering seminary, and I thought that I had done sufficient work to rid myself of bias. But what I began to see that first year in seminary was that a hatred of racism does not mean that I was free of racism. That racism indeed lives inside each of us, willing or not. As a first-year student in seminary, I took a class entitled Identity, Power, and Difference. And this class laid the foundation for the whole philosophy at Iliff School of Theology. That we are the ones we have been waiting for, and it is up to us. I was exposed that first quarter to the insidious ways that racism is socialized into every bird against their will. And I'll share with you the moment that it really, really lived inside of me. As part of this class, we had to spend a week together, 4 hours a day, for 5 days in a row, talking about these topics. To say that that was intense is an understatement. On the fourth day, we were invited to participate in creating scenarios acting out the 3 pillars of white supremacy. And this was a group of 20 multi-religious, multi-ethnic seminary students. We were each broken into small little groups and given a small scenario to act out before the rest of the class. The group that I was in had to act out slavery. I was cast as a Southern white woman, and my African American gentleman was cast as my servant. And there were other people at this tea party. And as we discussed how we were going to act out this scenario, it really struck me and hit home, because none of us needed to ask what we should do. We already knew. I knew exactly how to look at my colleague. And he knew exactly how to hold his body in relationship to mine. And so we acted it out. And we cried. And that's when it became real to me. That's when it became real. It lives inside of us against our will. I stopped participating that day in the narrative of colorblindedness. I stopped believing that it is enough to be non-racist in my personal life and began the work of shifting to a stance of being anti-racist. I had been taught my whole life to be colorblind, to seek the shared humanity rather than participate in racial stereotyping. And there's nothing wrong with seeking the shared humanity, but it's not enough. Racism is a complex and dynamic social structure, and it changes. And so yes, while the racism of the 1940s and 50s is long gone in most of our public and private spaces, the racism of 2017 has a whole new face for us to deal with. And we need different tools for understanding the racism of now, and different methods for attacking it and dismantling it. And one of those tools is understanding how privilege and power work. And in the United States right now, that means, by and large, understanding what it means to be white. That doesn't mean that only white people need to understand being white, but it does mean predominantly that. Not all of us in this room are white. Many of us are not. But we are a predominantly white denomination as Unitarian Universalists. And thus we are called to look at each other and to understand how whiteness shapes our denomination and our relationships with one another. Being white is being the proverbial top bird in the cage. And if we spend any time imagining that being the top bird is any less toxic than being a lower down bird, we do ourselves a great disservice. It is incumbent upon those that live at the top of the birdcage to use their resources, their time, their talent, and their treasure to dismantle, unlock, topple over, shake the bars, do whatever it takes to see again freely. All of us long for freedom. Every once in a while, a bird comes along that can see outside the cage with great clarity of voice and vision, and it shakes the whole cage up. And for a time, it seems that we will do more than just switch places on those rungs. You know many of these birds by name: Maya Angelou, Bell Hooks, Malcolm X, and of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These souls longed for freedom, and from their position within the cage, they somehow found the imagination to see beyond the bars and to see the bars at the same time. They boldly proclaimed a vision for where we might yet go. However, they also see the bars, and that is what we are called to start to see. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, when he cast that vision of a colorblind society in August of 1963, he had been frustrated with the white moderate community for their complacency for some time. Listen to his words written from a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama in April of that year. Quote, "First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time and constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection." Unquote. I would like to suggest that those words are as true today as they were in 1963. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was talking to us. Liberal religious people in a predominantly white denomination who too often have feared instability more than we have loved freedom. Our denomination is currently in the grips of a very divisive controversy related to our hiring practices at the denominational level. Some of you may have read that letter from Reverend Tamara and the Acorn, and if you have not, please take some time to read that, and we can discuss it afterwards in our discussion this afternoon. This controversy of hiring practices and racism within our denomination is not new. It has reared its head rightfully many times before, and it's unclear what the outcome might be this time. In the past, our denomination has made promises to our brothers and sisters of color and not followed through. I pray that this time we will finally find a new way. It is not enough for us to be non-racist. We must instead resist racism. We must take the position of being anti-racist. And that means we must stop telling the other birds what the outside of the cage should look like from our high up perch, and instead we should take a look at where we are perched and what it means if we are high up. And it means risking stepping off of whatever rung we are on. And none of us is privileged 100% or disadvantaged 100%. That is not what this is about. And it's not about feeling guilty or ashamed. It's about staying in relationship to one another. It's about sitting down at the table and staying connected to one another in covenant until we get to a place where we can work out our differences. This is important work that we are up to. For when we learn to see the bars of the cage, then maybe someday we can find the door. And if we can find the door, maybe someday we can fashion a key. And if we fashion the key, maybe one day we can open that door and we can fly free. But until then, let us not sing of what we see outside of the cage. Let us sing of what we can do together until that day comes when we can finally be free. Let us sing together a song of freedom that holds us in that tension for who we are right now and who we are capable of being in the future. It's going to take a lot of work to get there. And I think we're probably going to need God. So God help us. Amen. In standing and join hands if that is comfortable for you for the benediction. And I've put up this picture of my dear friends, in part because I just wanted to, but also because it was taken on my trip when I was in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, and it holds within it a promise of a better future. For the two in the far back, my dear friends Alistair and Stephanie, they met on this trip. Alistair is from Zimbabwe, and he was one of our drivers, and Stephanie was one of the students on the trip. And on April 29th, I'm going to co-officiate their wedding in Florida. And so I'm also putting this slide out to let you know that for the next 2 Sundays, or 2 Sundays after Easter, I won't be in the congregation because I'll be away at the wedding and at school. But I just wanted to share that picture, that despite all the differences of culture and time and place, ethnicity and background, that love can find its way through. And that is something to be celebrated. And our faith is dedicated, our congregation is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences, beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together, in spite of time and death and the spaces between the stars. We pause now in silent witness to that unity. May the blessings of love be upon you. May love's peace abide within you. May love's presence illuminate your heart now and forevermore. So be it. Amen, and blessed be. And now, as we extinguish our communal chalice, our service truly begins.